Chapter 13 of The Circular Staircase. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wina Hathaway. The Circular Staircase by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 13. Louise. The doctor from Englewood came very soon, and I went up to see the sick girl with him. Halsey had gone to supervise the fitting of the car with blankets and pillows, and Gertrude was opening and airing Louise's own rooms at the house. Her private sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room were as they had been when we came. They occupied the end of the east wing, beyond the circular staircase, and we had not even opened them. The girl herself was too ill to notice what was being done. When, with the help of the doctor, who was a fatherly man with a family of girls at home, we got her to the house and up the stairs into bed, she dropped into a feverish sleep which lasted until morning. Dr. Stewart, that was the Englewood doctor, stayed almost all night, giving the medicine himself and watching her closely. Afterward he told me that she had had a narrow escape from pneumonia, and that the cerebral symptoms had been rather alarming. I said I was glad it wasn't an itis of some kind anyhow, and he smiled solemnly. He left after breakfast, saying that he thought the worst of the danger was over, and that she must be kept very quiet. "The shock of 2 deaths, I suppose, has done this," he remarked, picking up his case. "It has been very deplorable." I hastened to set him right. "She does not know of either, doctor," I said. "Please do not mention them to her." He looked as surprised as a medical man ever does. "I do not know the family," he said, preparing to get into his top buggy. "Young Walker down in Casanova has been attending them. I understand he is going to marry this young lady." "You have been misinformed," I said stiffly. "Miss Armstrong is going to marry my nephew." The doctor smiled as he picked up the reins. "Young ladies are changeable these days," he said. "We thought the wedding was to occur soon. Well, I will stop in this afternoon to see how my patient is getting along." He drove away then, and I stood looking after him. He was a doctor of the old school, of the class of family practitioners that is fast dying out, a loyal and honorable gentleman who was at once physician and confidential adviser to his patients. When I was a girl we called in the doctor alike when we had measles, or when mother's sister died in the far West. He cut out redundant tonsils and brought the babies with the same air of inspiring self-confidence. Nowadays it requires a different specialist for each of these occurrences. When the babies cried, old Dr. Wainwright gave them peppermint and dropped warm sweet oil in their ears with sublime faith that if it was not colic, it was earache. When at the end of a year father met him driving in his high sidebar buggy with the white mare ambling along, and asked for a bill, the doctor used to go home, estimate what his services were worth for that period, divide it in half, I don't think he kept any books, and send father a statement in a cramped hand on a sheet of ruled white paper. He was an honored guest at all the weddings, christenings, and funerals. Yes, funerals, for everyone knew he had done his best, and there was no gainsaying the ways of Providence. Ah, well, Dr. Wainwright is gone, and I am an elderly woman with an increasing tendency to live in the past. The contrast between my old doctor at home and the Casanova doctor, Frank Walker, always rouses me to wrath and digression. Sometime about noon of that day, Wednesday, Mrs. Ogden Fitzhugh telephoned me. I have the barest acquaintance with her. She managed to be put on the governing board of the old ladies' home, and ruins their digestions by sending them ice cream and cake on every holiday. Beyond that, and their reputation at bridge, which is insufferably bad, she is the worst player at the bridge club. I know little of her. It was she who had taken charge of Arnold Armstrong's funeral, however, and I went at once to the telephone. "Yes," I said, "this is Miss Innes." "Miss Innes," she said volubly, "I have just received a very strange telegram from my cousin Mrs. Armstrong. Her husband died yesterday in California, and— Wait, I will read you the message." I knew what was coming, and I made up my mind at once. If Louise Armstrong had a good and sufficient reason for leaving her people and coming home, a reason, moreover, that kept her from going at once to Mrs. Ogden Fitzhugh, and that brought her to the lodge at Sunnyside instead, it was not my intention to betray her. Louise herself must notify her people. I do not justify myself now, but remember, I was in a peculiar position toward the Armstrong family. I was connected most unpleasantly with the cold-blooded crime, and my niece and nephew were practically beggared, either directly or indirectly, through the head of the family. Mrs. Fitzhugh had found the message. "Paul died yesterday. Heart disease," she read. "Wire at once if Louise is with you." You see, Miss Innes, Louise must have started east, and Fanny is alarmed about her." "Yes," I said. "Louise is not here," Mrs. Fitzhugh went on, "and none of her friends, the few who are still in town, has seen her. I called you because Sunnyside was not rented when she went away, and Louise might have gone there." "I am sorry, Mrs. Fitzhugh, but I cannot help you," I said, and was immediately filled with compunction. Suppose Louise grew worse. Who was I to play Providence in this case? The anxious mother certainly had a right to know that her daughter was in good hands. So I broke in on Mrs. Fitzhugh's voluble excuses for disturbing me. "Mrs. Fitzhugh," I said, "I was going to let you think I knew nothing about Louise Armstrong, but I have changed my mind. Louise is here, with me." There was a clatter of ejaculations at the other end of the wire. "She is ill and not able to be moved. Moreover, she is unable to see anyone. I wish you would wire her mother that she is with me and tell her not to worry. No, I do not know why she came east." "But, my dear Miss Innes," Mrs. Fitzhugh began. I cut in ruthlessly. "I will send for you as soon as she can see you," I said. "No, she is not in a critical state now, but the doctor says she must have absolute quiet." When I had hung up the receiver, I sat down to think. So Louise had fled from her people in California and had come east alone. It was not a new idea, but why had she done it? It occurred to me that Dr. Walker might be concerned in it, might possibly have bothered her with unwelcome attentions. But it seemed to me that Louise was hardly a girl to take refuge in flight under such circumstances. She had always been high-spirited, with the well-poised head and buoyant step of the outdoors girl. It must have been much more in keeping with Louise's character as I knew it, to resent vigorously any unwelcome attentions from Dr. Walker. It was the suitor whom I should have expected to see in headlong flight, not the lady in the case. The puzzle was no clearer at the end of the half-hour. I picked up the morning papers, which were still full of the looting of the Traders' Bank, the interest at fever height again on account of Paul Armstrong's death. The bank examiners were working on the books, and said nothing for publication. John Bailey had been released on bond. The body of Paul Armstrong would arrive Sunday and would be buried from the Armstrong townhouse. There were rumors that the dead man's estate had been a comparatively small one. The last paragraph was the important one. Walter P. Broadhurst of the Marine Bank had produced 200 American traction bonds, which had been placed as security with the Marine Bank for a loan of $160,000 made to Paul Armstrong just before his California trip. The bonds were a part of the missing traction bonds from the Traders' Bank. While this involved the late president of the wrecked bank, to my mind it by no means cleared its cashier. The gardener mentioned by Halsey came out about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and walked up from the station. I was favorably impressed by him. His references were good. He had been employed by the Brays until they went to Europe, and he looked young and vigorous. He asked for one assistant, and I was glad enough to get off so easily. He was a pleasant-faced young fellow, with black hair and blue eyes, and his name was Alexander Graham. I've been particular about Alex because, as I said before, he played an important part later. That afternoon I had a new insight into the character of the dead banker. I had my first conversation with Louise. She sent for me, and against my better judgment, I went. There were so many things she could not be told in her weakened condition that I dreaded the interview. It was much easier than I expected, however, because she asked no questions. Gertrude had gone to bed, having been up almost all night, and Halsey was absent on one of those mysterious absences of his that grew more and more frequent as time went on, until it culminated in the event of the night of June the 10th. Liddy was in attendance in the sick room. There being little or nothing to do, she seemed to spend her time smoothing the wrinkles from the counterpane. Louise lay under a field of virgin white, folded back at an angle of geometrical exactness, and necessitating a readjustment every time the sick girl turned. Liddy heard my approach and came out to meet me. She seemed to be in a perpetual state of gooseflesh, and she had got in the habit of looking past me when she talked, as if she saw things. It had the effect of making me look over my shoulder to see what she was staring at, and was intensely irritating. "She's awake," Liddy said, looking uneasily down the circular staircase which was beside me. "She was talking in her sleep something awful, about dead men and coffins." "Liddy," I said sternly, "did you breathe a word about everything not being right here?" Liddy's gaze had wandered to the door of the chute, now bolted securely. "Not a word," she said, "beyond asking her a question or two, which there was no harm in. She says there never was a ghost known here." I glared at her, speechless, and closing the door into Louise's boudoir, to Liddy's great disappointment, I went on to the bedroom beyond. Whatever Paul Armstrong had been, he had been lavish with his stepdaughter. Gertrude's rooms at home were always beautiful apartments, but the 3 rooms in the east wing at Sunnyside, set apart for the daughter of the house, were much more splendid. From the walls to the rugs on the floor, from the furniture to the appointments of the bath, with its pool sunk in the floor instead of the customary unlovely tub, everything was luxurious. In the bedroom Louise was watching for me. It was easy to see that she was much improved. The flush was going, and the peculiar gasping breathing of the night before was now a comfortable and easy respiration. She held out her hand, and I took it between both of mine. "What can I say to you, Miss Innes?" she said slowly, "to have come like this. I thought she was going to break down, but she did not." "You are not to think of anything but of getting well," I said, patting her hand. "When you are better, I'm going to scold you for not coming here at once. This is your home, my dear, and of all people in the world, Halsey's old aunt ought to make you welcome." She smiled a little sadly, I thought. "I ought not to see Halsey," she said. "Miss Innes, there are a great many things you will never understand, I'm afraid. I am an impostor on your sympathy, because I stay here and let you lavish care on me, and all the time I know you're going to despise me." "Nonsense," I said briskly. "Why, what would Halsey do to me if I even ventured such a thing? He is so big and masterful that if I dared to be anything but rapturous over you, he would throw me out of a window. Indeed, he would be quite capable of it." She seemed scarcely to hear my facetious tone. She had eloquent brown eyes. The Inneses are fair and are prone to a grayish-green optic that is better for use than appearance, and they seemed now to be clouded with trouble. "Poor Halsey," she said softly. "Miss Innes, I cannot marry him, and I am afraid to tell him. I am a coward, a coward." I sat beside the bed and stared at her. She was too ill to argue with, and, besides, sick people take queer fancies. "We will talk about that when you are stronger," I said gently. "But there are some things I must tell you," she insisted. "You must wonder how I came here, and why I stayed hidden at the lodge. Dear old Thomas had been almost crazy, Miss Innes. I did not know that Sunnyside was rented. I knew my mother wished to rent it, without telling my stepfather, but the news must have reached her after I left. When I started east, I had only one idea: to be alone with my thoughts for a time, to bury myself here. Then I must have taken a cold on the train." "You came east in clothing suitable for California," I said. "And, like all young girls nowadays, I don't suppose you wear flannels." But she was not listening. "Miss Innes," she said, "has my stepbrother Arnold gone away?" "What do you mean?" I asked, startled. But Louise was literal. "He didn't come back that night," she said, "and it was so important that I should see him." "I believe he has gone away," I replied uncertainly. "Isn't it something we could attend to instead?" But she shook her head. "I must do it myself," she said dully. "My mother must have rented Sunnyside without telling my stepfather. And, Miss Innes, did you ever hear of anyone being wretchedly poor in the midst of luxury? Did you ever long and long for money, money to use without question, money that no one would take you to task about? My mother and I have been surrounded for years with every indulgence everything would ever make a display. But we have never had any money, Miss Innes. That must have been why my mother rented this house. My stepfather pays out bills. It's the most maddening, humiliating existence in the world. I would love honest poverty better." "Never mind," I said. "When you and Halsey are married, you can be as honest as you like, and you will certainly be poor." Halsey came to the door at that moment, and I could hear him coaxing Liddy for admission to the sick room. "Shall I bring him in?" I asked Louise, uncertain what to do. The girl seemed to shrink back among her pillows at the sound of his voice. I was vaguely irritated with her. There are a few young fellows like Halsey, straightforward, honest, and willing to sacrifice everything for the one woman. I knew one once, more than 30 years ago, who was like that. He died a long time ago. And sometimes I take out his picture, with its cane and its queer silk hat, and I look at it. But of late years it has grown too painful. He is always a boy, and I am an old woman. I would not bring him back if I could. Perhaps it was some such memory that made me call out sharply, "Come in, Halsey." And then I took my sewing and went into the boudoir beyond to play propriety. I did not try to hear what they said, but every word came through the open door with curious distinctness. Halsey had evidently gone over to the bed, and I suppose he kissed her. There was silence for a moment, as if words were superfluous things. "I've been almost wild, sweetheart," Halsey's voice. "Why didn't you trust me and send for me before?" "It was because I couldn't trust myself," she said in a low tone. "I am too weak to struggle today. Oh, Halsey, how I have wanted to see you!" There was something I did not hear. Then Halsey again. "We could go away," he was saying. "What does it matter about anyone in the world but just the two of us? To be always together like this, hand in hand. Louise, don't tell me it isn't going to be. I won't believe you." "You don't know. You don't know," Louise repeated dully. "Halsey, I care. You know that. But not enough to marry you." "That is not true, Louise," he said sternly. "You cannot look at me with your honest eyes and say that." "I cannot marry you," she repeated miserably. "It's bad enough, isn't it? Don't make it worse. Some day before long you will be glad." "Then it is because you never loved me." There were depths of hurt pride in his voice. "You saw how much I loved you, and you let me think you cared, for a while. No, that isn't like you, Louise. There is something you haven't told me. Is it because there is someone else?" "Yes," almost inaudibly. "Louise, oh, I don't believe it." "It is true," she said sadly. "Halsey, you must not try to see me again. As soon as I can, I am going away from here, where you are all so much kinder than I deserve. And whatever you hear about me, try to think of me as well as you can. I'm going to marry another man. How you must hate me, hate me!" I could hear Halsey cross the room to the window. Then, after a pause, he went back to her again. I could hardly sit still. I wanted to go in and give her a good shaking. "Then it's all over," he was saying with a long breath. "The plans we made together, the hopes, all of it, over. Well, I'll not be a baby, and I'll give you up the minute you say I don't love you and I do love someone else." "I cannot say that," she breathed. "But very soon I shall marry the other man." I could hear Halsey's low, triumphant laugh. "I defy him," he said. "Sweetheart, as long as you care for me, I am not afraid." The wind slammed the door between the two rooms just then, and I could hear nothing more, although I moved my chair quite close. After a discreet interval, I went into the other room and found Louise alone. She was staring with sad eyes at the cherub painted on the ceiling over the bed, and because she looked tired, I did not disturb her. End of Chapter 13. Recording by Rinehart in Fayetteville, North Carolina.